Now, this fundamentally challenges, Tom, where sports nutrition guidelines are coming from, because they are based off the belief that substrate carbohydrate oxidation as a important fuel substrate is incredibly important to perform well during exercise.
Dr. Andrew Koutnik, your lab just published some really interesting stuff surrounding carbohydrates versus no carbohydrates in some intense exercise, like not just like long distance stuff. Let's just jump right into it, man. What did you guys find? What was this study about? Then let's break down some other studies your lab has done.
There's been a lot of thought around it's really important to have carbohydrates right before performance. And we have published a number of studies leading up to this, but we were really interested in, when people think they're going to go run their first race, they're probably going to go run a 5K, or like maybe if they train long enough, they might do a 10K, right? So we're really interested in these different forms of exercise and short, middle, long duration. But we recently published something on 5 to 10K performance. And what we did is we asked subjects to come in, and what we like to do as much as we can is try to control as many variables as possible we know impact performance. And that's not a common thing because it's very difficult to do, but we did that. And then we asked subjects, hey, we want you to eat a very, very low carbohydrate based meal right before exercise. But then we also want you to eat a high carbohydrate based meal, which is what is currently sports nutrition recommendations right before exercise. And we had published a number of studies leading into this that made us think, historically, sports nutrition guidelines would say that you need those carbohydrates to have peak level performance. But we're seeing all this evidence from our groups and others that when you controlled all the confounding variables, that we weren't seeing that carbohydrates were having quite nearly the same level of impact, especially not at the volumes in which we're being recommended, like 60 grams per hour during exercise or 120 grams per hour during exercise. We just weren't seeing that. And so we actually wanted to test it. So we ran a randomized control crossover trial where we asked subjects to eat a high carbohydrate-based meal and a low carbohydrate-based meal, and then run as fast as they possibly could a 5K time trial. Then we also asked another cohort of 15 subjects to do a 10K time trial. And this was, again, on both diets. And what we found was that when looking at these two different nutrition paradigms, one that's currently gold standard recommendation for optimal performance during exercise, the high carb approach, versus this very low carbohydrate approach, which a lot of sports nutrition world would speculate would impair performance, we saw no difference in performance, okay? This middle distance performance. And one fascinating component to this is, one, it didn't impact performance. This, again, goes against key sports nutrition dogmatic thinking, but we were able to control key variables that a lot of studies previously had not. But when actually looking at the key biomarkers of what drove performance, a lot of people point to, okay, you need to be able to burn as many carbohydrates as possible during exercise as you can, because there was all this evidence that had suggested that's a more efficient fuel at higher intensities. Well, we found that these two different pre-exercise meals produce distinct levels of carbohydrate oxidation and distinct levels of fat oxidation. And despite completely distinct levels of what type of fuel they were performing on, they had the same exact performance. Now, this fundamentally challenges, Tom, where sports nutrition guidelines are coming from, because they are based off the belief that substrate carbohydrate oxidation as a important fuel substrate is incredibly important to perform well during exercise. And despite having one nutritional approach before exercise that lowered carbohydrate oxidation and one that increased it, we didn't see a difference in performance. So it really gets to this question of, are carbohydrates actually essential to maintain your peak performance? And we've done a number of studies that really begin to unravel and challenge whether that's actually true.
I recommend having like some salt or some salty electrolytes. I put a link down below for the ones that I use. Helps a ton when you're fasting or when you're calorically deprived, where you're trying to just reduce calories in general. So that is called LMNT, and that link gets you a free sample variety pack with any purchase. Okay, so with any purchase, you get a free pack of electrolytes that you can keep for yourself, you can give to your friends. It's a pack of their leading flavors. So this is cool because you're getting kind of a freebie with it. But I'm telling you, with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, it does curb your appetite. I can say firsthand, I've been using it for 7 years, like when I fast or when I'm reducing calories, game changer. So try adding something like that in if you're trying to reduce calories instead of maybe a diet soda. It's a good alternative.
So when you look at, well, first off, what did the low carb diet look like? Like how low carb was it?
Very low. I mean, the whole goal of it in this trial, it was actually asking them to consume a very low carbohydrate based meal, because we just wanted to see
immediate effect.
Immediate effect, the acute response. Like, hey, you need to eat this before exercise. I'm sure many people who run a marathon or are about to perform in some exercise bout, they're like, okay, carb load. Okay, you need to fill out your glycogen levels. You need a carb load. You need to do all these things. And that all came from the belief that you need to have higher levels of glucose being burned during exercise to have better performance. You need higher levels of glycogen levels during exercise to have optimal performance. And so that's where that came from. But what we were seeing is that those things did not predict performance when we controlled key variables in our study. So this is really an acute response study looking at the direct impact of a meal right before exercise, from a high carbohydrate approach to a low, very low carbohydrate based approach right before you go in to perform something like a 5K or 10K middle distance run.
Do you suspect that fasted state would have performed similarly?
It's interesting you ask that, because everything says that pre-exercise nutrition is incredibly important, but there are some studies from Philip Prince's group, who's a key collaborator of ours at Grove City College, that show that at least for 5K performance, that fasting leading into an exercise doesn't inherently impair exercise performance. I think things get a little more nuanced though when you get beyond the middle distance time frame and get into these longer duration exercise bouts, where there is more evidence that suggests that pre-exercise nutrition may have a more important impact. But yes, there are studies looking at 5K time trials where fasting doesn't impair performance compared to not fasting. Not saying that all evidence supports that, but there is certainly evidence that has emerged in the last 2 years that has suggested that.
And would you consider like a 5K still pretty, I mean, man, it's like the people that are running 5Ks fast, I mean, they gotta be still, not full beta oxidation. I mean, they're probably those guys are sitting in like a good zone 3, hitting zone 4 sometimes. I mean, those guys are fast, right?
And it really depends on their level of athletic performance. So we know that a person just coming off the street, just getting out and exercising, if they ran that as fast as they possibly can, I guess the better way to frame this, Tom, is to say, we know that athletes who are elite level performers can maintain extremely high levels of their maximal oxygen capacity, or a VO2 max. They can maintain a very high percentage of that, upwards of 90+% for long durations of time. Whereas for someone else who isn't trained at that huge volumes at very high intensities, if they went up to 90 to 95%, they would very quickly start to see deteriorations in performance pretty rapidly. Whereas what we're really seeing with elite level athletes is their ability to maintain that high intensity for very prolonged periods of time. So
when you control for that variable, the brain, substrates don't seem to matter as much. But well, could you almost speculate that when you're not dealing with an athlete mind, that they're going to be more sensitive to the changes because they don't have maybe that athlete override? Let's just call it that.
I would say, I would actually say, Tom, that it depends. So when you think about athletes who are attempting to reach peak level performance, what we have repeatedly showed is that, because we've done studies back in 2023 where we asked individuals who were high-end athletes, but not elite. Okay, not elite. They were, running over 50 kilometers per week, lean body weight, high VO2 maxes, middle age. And what we found that when we asked these individuals to undergo a ketogenic diet for 4 weeks, then run a 1 mile time trial, so much shorter than a 5K or a 10K, so very short duration, very intense, okay? Like this is not an easy thing to do. Someone's like, oh, 1 mile, Tom, that's no big deal. 1 mile at a slow pace is no big deal.
1 mile sucks.
1 mile at your fastest pace possible is absolutely one of the most brutal forms of
torture.
That's a great term, actually. That's a really great term. It's actually something that a lot of elite level track athletes would describe as one of the hardest distances to maintain because it's so grueling and so brutal, but it's for the fastest in the world around 4 minutes, for some of these athletes. That's incredibly elite. That said, I think that when we talk about, but that's a 1 mile time trial. And what we found is that we didn't see any differences or deterioration in performance when they were having low carbohydrate based diets, as long as they adapted to it for 4 weeks in duration, for not only a 1 mile time trial, but also 6 by 800 meter sprints. And this is when we would traditionally believe that carbohydrates were essential, with quotes around it, for maintaining high levels of exercise intensity. In fact, they were performing at over 85% of their VO2 max, when we would suspect, based on all historical sports nutrition literature, that you would be burning near zero levels. Around 10% would be from carbohydrates at that stage, but instead, near zero levels of fat. Whereas you would be almost completely reliant in these more short-term, highly intense forms of exercise on carbohydrates. And what we found is that when these athletes reduced their carbohydrates over a 4-week window of time and actually adapted to that diet, we found that there was no difference in performance, but that the way in which they were able to sustain performance on a ketogenic diet was they were burning over 1.5 grams of fat per minute. In fact, some athletes were burning north of 1.85 grams per minute, which is the highest ever reported levels of fat oxidation in the literature ever. And it was at over 85% of their VO2 max, when we would historically believe
that's not possible.
Not possible.
Yeah.
In fact, we thought that fat oxidation levels would be virtually zero, based on all historical models and paradigm in sports nutrition. I mean, this completely shattered that understanding, not only for us, but in general. But then there's this other extreme end of the spectrum, Tom, where we thought, okay, well, what about if you go to the opposite end of the spectrum, go for a prolonged, strenuous, basically hitting the wall trial, where you go as long as you possibly can to sustain performance. And in this case, we recruited Ironman competitors who had completed an Ironman, so some very, very high-end athletes. And we asked them to do the same thing, to dramatically reduce the amount of carbohydrates in their diet to less than 50 grams per day.
How much convincing did that take, by the way? I'm just curious.
So it's funny you ask that, because it's not just, we had them on each diet for 6 weeks. And then we had a 2-week washout period between each successive diet, because what we wanted was the diet to be long enough to control for changes from the previous diet. If they started, like, say, low carb first, we wanted the diet to be sufficiently long and the crossover period to be sufficiently long as well, to wash out as many of those effects as we possibly can, because some of those linger after the diet is over. But they didn't just do 6 weeks on each diet. They did 6 weeks, 2-week crossover, 6 weeks. I mean, they were committed to this for 14 weeks. And on top of that, we asked them to control their activity, which they did, their calories, and
you don't have to worry about Ironman athletes not wanting to track things. I think they're very meticulous people, but I know that they're also inherently some of the most dietary, stubborn people I've ever met, right?
Yeah.
Getting them to go low carb. You've got your pockets of low carb endurance people and then you've got the ones that'll just die on the sword and will die before you tell them, before they'll actually go low carb. That's why I asked you have to convince these people.
Yeah, and you'd be amazed how entrenched this is. Actually, you wouldn't be amazed, but it's very entrenched. However, what we've found as well is that, we're running a survey right now looking at a large cohort of athletes using one of these performance-based apps where you track. And, this is preliminary. It can't speak too much to it now. I can just say that I don't think that is as entrenched as people think. I think the evidence that our group and others have produced that have showed that hey, whether you're running a 1 mile time trial, 600 by 800 meter sprints, very short duration, very high intense forms of exercise, whether you're running a 5K or 10K, whether you're over here doing a hitting the wall trial to exhaustion, and you're asked to go for 2 to 4 hours nonstop at a very high strenuous form of exercise. Any one of these, what we've consistently showed that is that lower carbohydrate intake as a part of a habitual diet does not reliably impair performance. So I think athletes are becoming aware of this, and I think more athletes are attempting to try it and see how they do. But there's a lot of nuance here when someone embarks on, let's say, a lower carbohydrate diet paradigm. If you're an athlete, because we know there are predictable and preventable pitfalls of these diets that athletes have to be even more mindful of, because they're focused on performance outcomes, whereas someone who's not focused on performance maybe not notice some of these unique distinctions of, let's say, consuming the right minerals, the right supplements on the diet, to calories, to when you place protein or the amount of protein, or even so far as to say, do you place some strategic carbohydrates in the diet? Would that improve performance? I think those are important things for athletes to understand when they embark on this diet, because those are critical nuance to maintaining and maximize performance on these distinct diets. And I want to add something here, Tom, because some athletes may say, well, if they're able to maintain, top level performance in the ketogenic diet, but they could have done that on high carb, like why make the shift? And I want to make something very clear. In our first study in 2023, we saw that 30% of the athletes who are on a high carb diet developed glucose levels consistent with prediabetes, meaning that some of these athletes were developing glucose levels that would indicate some form of underlying metabolic derangement or dysfunction. And that's something we're seeing much more ubiquitously in American society. Up to 93% of individuals have some form of metabolic derangement. Over 86% or 68% of individuals are obese, which accumulates often unmeasured levels of elevated insulin, inflammation, oxidative stress, changes in the entire metabolism. So we're seeing these things at much higher levels, and it's become a much more pertinent topic, even in those we thought were immune to metabolic dysfunction. Athletes, not only athletes, but athletes who are lean and exercising regularly. So they're not immune. In fact, there's a paradigm called the fit but unhealthy athlete. And this was written by Phil Larson and Phil Maffetone in Sports Medicine, describing the key measures that often lead athletes to, yes, perform well, but actually be unhealthy. Mm-hmm. And when you think, oh, you're an elite level athlete, they must be some of the healthiest people on earth. Not always, Tom. Not always. Particularly, one of the key variables they described in this, besides, common themes of like, okay, maybe they're overtraining or training high volumes that are unhelpful, or they have high levels of stress they're not recovering from. But one of the most important variables they describe is these very high glycolytic, rapid forms of carbohydrates they're consuming that can lead to these rapid spikes in glucose and rapid spikes in insulin that they're repeatedly giving themselves for. If you're a high-level athlete exercising for 4 hours a day, for 4 hours straight, you're giving 60 to 120 grams of very rapid forms of carbohydrates that spike glucose and insulin every day, 4 hours every day.
Yeah, it doesn't matter whether you're moving and utilizing that or not. That is a consistent. You look at like the Tour de France guys, like what is it now? Like, I mean, keeping glucose steady at like a 160 plus for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, I've seen world record holders' glycemic responses, and I will just say that I think that there's a new awareness that there is, one, because of the growing elevation in chronic disease numbers in the United States, alarming levels. Even kids are seeing like up to 20% of kids have obesity and prediabetes. I mean, this is basically, they were immune to these things before, and we're starting to see it. So even athletes were starting to see this as well. And I think it gets to a question of, we know that one of the most important ways that you can regulate your overall metabolic health, and that's what we're talking is the kind of epicenter of this discussion, around not just performance, but also your overall health, is your metabolism and how it functions. And we know the most powerful way to change your metabolism, Tom, is through diet, without question. We know exercise is a very potent way to change metabolism. There's other ways to change metabolism, but the most powerful way to do it is through diet. And so there's a key question for athletes to consider in their journey to not only to maximize performance, but also maximize health, is what diet should I be consuming to not just get one, but ideally to get both, because no athlete should be sacrificed at the altar of performance. Their health should not be sacrificed as a consequence of trying to have elite level performance. In an ideal world, you want to have both. And this is a conversation around diet that I think is super critical, because even some of the most impressive athletes out there, some of which who've been, I give them tremendous accolades, have come public and disclosed that they had developed prediabetes. In fact, one who was very public about it, and I give him a lot of credit, is Lionel Sanders. He was a 2017 or 2018 world champion Ironman completer, and openly disclosed last year that he developed prediabetes. In fact, he said, I felt tired, lethargic, wasn't sleeping well, didn't feel like I was recovering, just my mood was poor. I go to the doctor, get blood work, everything seems fine. And I looked at my average levels of glucose over the last 2 months, and it showed I was in prediabetes. And he said he made some rapid changes in the type of ultra-processed forms of carbohydrates, dramatically reduced those things in his diet, immediately resolved his prediabetes, which is something we also observed in our study, that when athletes move from these higher carbohydrate diets to low carbohydrate, very low carbohydrate ketogenic diets, they rapidly, almost within the first week, resolve these glucose levels away from pre-diabetic levels, the ones who did have elevated levels. And nearly all the athletes saw a reduction in glucose, except for one. So it's a pretty common phenomenon in this respect. But when he then went on to remove these in the diet, he went on to win, and he said he reported feeling better, he resolved his prediabetes, and then he went on to win the half Ironman world championship. So I think this is a conversation that's being elevated, because I was skeptical myself. I live with a chronic irreversible metabolic disease of type 1 diabetes, where glucose and insulin is paramount to our long-term health and overall lifespan, but it also affects how we feel every single day at every single meal. Whereas these athletes don't often see these things until years and years of accumulated effects over time before they see this end signal of elevation in glucose. And that's usually a consequence of not just, a couple bad meals, but usually a consequence of years of choices, sometimes to attempting to improve their health based on what sports nutrition has told them to improve their health. And it might not always be doing that for their overall health.
I mean, calling a spade, they live with the blinders on for performance, right?
It's fair enough, yeah.
I mean, we've said many times that, I think if you told an athlete that they could eat a dog turd and it would make them perform better, they would do it. It's not about, it's especially, I think Ironman athletes are interesting, because you start finding that the elite level Ironman athletes are actually a little bit older than elite level athletes in a lot of other sports. I mean, that's changing a little bit, but I think some of it has to do with the time commitment, right? Like, so
yeah, that's true.
For recreational to moderately elite, people that would still have to work a full-time job, that are not professional, the time commitment, right? We are either independently wealthy, or you are maybe a little bit older and at a position in your life when you can actually dedicate that time. So you do find that. So I think there might be more awareness of their metabolic health and their long-term health in maybe a cohort like Ironman athletes. But if you were to take that to say something that was like a younger sprinter or a CrossFit athlete, dude, they'll tell you to F off. They would, they just, right? It's just because it's not even in their scope of awareness at all. And especially when you start getting into like fitness, bodybuilding, like forget it. Like they're gonna absolutely die at 30, doing what they want to do for every ounce of performance or muscle mass. So, fortunately you're dealing with Ironman athletes, which are probably like, they're thinking about these things a little bit more, but they're also like their finger on the pulse of their metabolic health, maybe a little bit more than some of these other sports. But I think we're going to get to a point where we're going to see a lot of athletes, endurance athletes, all kinds of athletes that are in their 20s and 30s now. I think in 10 years, it is going to be an epidemic of metabolic issues with these athletes. Just mark my words on it, because they are marinating their cells and their tissues in glucose, and they're not being educated on glycation. They're not being educated on all these things that are happening. It doesn't matter if you are burning through it, if you are marinating your cells and tissues in that level of glucose, there's going to be levels of DNA damage. There's going to be levels of arterial damage. It's going to happen, and it's overlooked because performance is fine at the moment.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
Agreed.
And that's what athletes need to understand, is it doesn't have to be that way. And, I'm all for improving performance. I mean, I was that person when I was, 18, 19, 20. I wanted to do anything to be bigger, stronger, faster. And I wasn't even an elite athlete. I just wanted to do it for my own personal goals and achievement. But I think it is incredibly important for athletes who may be listening to this, or someone who, the coaches or healthcare professionals who are navigating athletes, to know that it does not have to be that way. What we, one of the things you bring up is like you kind of forecast this potential epidemic that might be coming in athletics around poor health. But I actually attempted to look into that, because when our results came out and we saw 30% showing glucose levels consistent with prediabetes, I didn't believe it. These are 10% body fat, high VO2 maxes running over 50 kilometers per week. That was just the level of bare minimums to enter the study. This wasn't like some of them were even in better shape than that. That was just average, right? And some of them develop these poor glucose levels that we know are associated with derangement, prediabetes, and the long-term consequences of that. And so I didn't believe it. And so I actually started to look around for other signals of if we were maybe seeing an outlier response in our data, because it's possible. We looked at 10 athletes. We did one of the more controlled trials there was, randomized. We controlled calories. We controlled their body weight. We controlled their activity. We monitored their compliance with the diet with ketone levels and continuous glucose monitors. I mean, we did a lot of things that most people don't do. We had a registered dietitian monitoring them and keeping on tabs with them frequently, all that stuff. But I didn't necessarily buy it because I'm like, well, maybe it was just our study. And so I started looking around at other studies that had used not just static measures of glucose control that are often used to diagnose someone with diabetes. Okay, what are those for those who are unfamiliar? There's three. Number one is fasting glucose. Number two is an oral glucose tolerance test. And number three is an hemoglobin A1C. Real quick for your audience, fasting glucose is a single blood measurement often taken every 6 to 12 months at one time point in one day of 365 days of the year. The meal you had the night before can influence that fasting glucose value. That's a single snapshot of one moment in health. It's incredibly limited. Number two is an oral glucose tolerance test. This is just throwing back 75 grams of glucose and testing to see if you can bring your glucose levels down into a normal range. Number one, that test is only valid in high carbohydrate environments. It's not valid in ketogenic environments. It also isn't always, not everyone's enthusiastic about doing an oral glucose tolerance test and throwing back 75 grams of what is equivalent to a soda. But it's also not perfect because it's a single day. Okay, what if you exercise the day before? We know exercise can have 24 to 48 hour insulin sensitizing effects for some individuals. So that's highly variable. So again, a single snapshot. Or you have HbA1c, which is an average of your glucose in the blood over a 2 to 3 month period of time. So that seems like a better measure. However, Tom, we know that that's related to how glucose sticks to the red blood cell. And everyone's a little different in how the glucose actually enzymatically binds to that measure or to tissue to measure it. And so these all have major limitations. So what we did instead is we tracked glucose levels every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day over each 4 to 6 week diet period. Okay, the entire time. And this is using something called a continuous glucose monitor. We also calibrated that against actual real blood glucose. So it's interstitial glucose is where these CGMs sit. And those track much better with actual real glucose levels in real time. And we use those as the measure. Now, I looked at studies that did the same exact thing in athletes to try to see, hey, in our study, we saw 30%. Is that normal? What we found is that when this was in middle-aged athletes, that's also important because this is the window between young, healthy, and sometimes what appears to be immune to some of these metabolic dysfunction issues. And then over 65 years of age and older individuals where your risk of at least one form of metabolic dysfunction is nearly guaranteed. And so this is middle window of this transition between these two states. That's why we wanted to look at it. We thought that was important. But what if you're younger? Well, I pulled some data in younger athletes to various spectrums and even elite athletes from other researchers and other groups. And when looking at all these studies, and we actually published this in 2023 in a research article, The Low Carbohydrate Ketogenic Diet on Glycemic Homeostasis and Frontiers. And what you will see in that article is I actually showed the individual response of athletes that are published using these monitors at least 7 days. Because keep in mind, the other measurements we talked about, fasting glucose, oral glucose tolerance test, and HbA1c, hemoglobin A1c, are incredibly limited. CGMs provide a much more dynamic and dense look at glycemic control over time. And I looked at only the studies that showed those in athletes. And what you find is that there is an incidence of levels consistent with prediabetes, even in the fasted state. Okay, not just 24 hours, but in the fasted state, in anywhere from 10 to 30%. In fact, some studies showed as high as 60% in some athletes. And so we weren't alone in seeing this. This has actually been reported in a number of other studies. It did appear that age was influenced it a bit, so those who were younger were more immune to having these issues. But it wasn't the body mass of these athletes, BMI. It wasn't their aerobic power or capacity or their VO2 max. It was actually the biggest predictor on what their glucose control was in the fasted state was what they were eating during the day. Specifically, the amount of carbohydrates they're consuming. That predicted the actual level of glucose in the fasted state. So often people think, oh, well, because the fasted state, Tom, represents your underlying metabolic state. Exactly. It's independent of what you do in any particular moment with exercise or you ate a meal at your favorite restaurant. Obviously, those cause rapid changes throughout the day in glucose and insulin. But when you look at the fasted state, it clears up all that noise. And in the clearest state, when you remove all the smoke, all these other variables, we saw that elevated glucose levels consistent with prediabetes was most commonly associated and predicted, not even by age, to the same degree that the carbohydrate volume you were consuming in the day predicted your actual basal metabolic state after all that was removed. So there's something clearly happening in athletes that is unique and related to their diet. And what was very interesting and unsurprising is when we published this work, I had a lot of physicians and athletes themselves who never talked about this reaching out and saying, hey, that's me. So I'm not saying this is ubiquitous, but what I'm saying is there's a percentage of athletes who are experiencing this that is often going undetected, and diet appears to be the number one predictive factor for why that's happening.
Do you feel, when you say that about the fasted state, like removing all the noise and it's kind of like it's just like a clear snapshot of like your true metabolic state, is that why I would almost guess why someone that is in poor metabolic health has a much harder time in a fasted state? Like they feel hungry, they feel like they're usually the ones that are saying, I can't do it fasted, I need food. Some of it's psychological, but I mean, really, you talk about people that are metabolically flexible, like there's no qualms whatsoever. They're just like, sure, I can train fasted. Like they don't really have an issue with it. And then you talk to other people that are, insulin resistant, things like that. Like they're the ones that usually, and this isn't even a knock on them. And sometimes I'm thinking of like the regular person here for a second that you ask them to go train fasted and they're going to have, whoa, are you kidding me? Like,
So there's something really fascinating that we see when we actually measure this phenomenon is there's a lot of pieces of data that actually support exactly what you're saying. There's an abundance of literature that shows that when athletes consume high amounts of carbohydrates before exercise, they're actually not per se improving their overall energetic availability or output. They're just shifting where the nutrients are coming from. So when you eat a bunch of carbohydrates right before exercise, you see a spike in insulin. Insulin binds the fat cell at very, very low levels at high potency, meaning you don't need much insulin to have a profound impact on how fat cells work. And it shuts down fat breakdown for fat oxidation. So when athletes are consuming higher carbohydrate-based diets, they are paradoxically inhibiting the degrees of fat oxidation they can tap into, becoming what some may call less metabolically flexible. We also see that when they do that, they paradoxically break down muscle glycogen. Why? Because if you're trying to maintain prolonged strenuous exercise output and you're blocking fat oxidation, where do you get the other substrates from for carbohydrates? You have to pull it from the stored forms in the muscle. So oftentimes people are consuming high amounts of carbohydrates before exercise or during exercise, and they think that they're preventing the breakdown of muscle glycogen. And they are paradoxically forcing it to be broken down because they're blocking a component of fat oxidation during exercise. And so
I just want to make sure I'm clear on it, because that's fascinating. So if you have circulating insulin and it's inhibiting lipolysis, then you are paradoxically forcing the body to essentially like have no choice but to almost break down even muscle tissue at that rate too, I would imagine. Like it could almost be, I mean, it seems like it's funny because like carbohydrates are anti-catabolic, but probably only in that moment. So I just want to make sure, if you have circulating insulin, do you have this, is it also anti-catabolic at the same time? So is it forcing you to pull from glycogen, or is it like if you were to go for long periods of time and you've paradoxically shifted that state, could you actually make the argument that you're going to waste muscle faster than if you were metabolically flexible and able to be in a fasted state?
what we see over time with long-term adaptation on particular diets, we see that when individuals are, well, number one, insulin is a very anabolic hormone. So when it elevates, yes, you are causing growth or anabolism. You are blocking the breakdown of tissue, including fat and including muscle. But we know there are a number of other key counter-regulatory mechanisms at play when you consume diets like a ketogenic diet that are much lower in the amount of insulin that are being released, upwards of 33 to 75% reductions in insulin on these diets, because you see upregulations in things like ketone bodies. Fat now becomes an overwhelming predominant form of energy. Upwards of like 80% of energy is now coming from fat. And so ketones can directly block protein catabolism and breakdown. And so it's very much dependent on the context of the diet. But to your so people would think lower insulin, oh, it's going to be more catabolic. We see that that's not inherently the case because there's all these other mechanisms at play depending on the setting. But to your point, I would contend that when we think about muscle health and we think about overall muscle function, usually we're not actually per se thinking about insulin unless you're a bodybuilder. You know, if you're a bodybuilder, like, oh, I want to have more insulin to cause anabolism and more growth. But the irony of that is that, as we were talking about before, that the insulin is much more potent at the fat cell at much lower levels than it is the muscle cell. That is why when you consume higher levels of carbohydrates right before exercise or during it, that you are first preventing the fat cell from being broken down. And then that lack of availability of fat oxidation potential has to be supplemented elsewhere and is forcing the glycogen breakdown in the muscle. You would only suspect that once you are not able to sufficiently maintain glucose levels, that you would have to pull from something else. And where would you pull it from? Well, historical literature back to the 1960s says that the only place to pull that from is one, the glycerol backbone of fat, but that only counts for 10% in the context of an extreme restriction like a fast.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Amino acids would have to come from your muscle, and that can only account for another 30 to 40%. And so ultimately your body is forced to pull from other things like fat, and then the conversion of things like ketone bodies, even just to maintain things like brain energy metabolism during these kind of extreme environments like fast, or let's say very, very, or other things like that where insulin are essentially what we're referring to here, like in the context around extreme low levels of nutrients, or pushing it to the opposite end by increasing energy expenditure to high degrees.
Now, how long does it take an elite athlete usually to rip through their liver and muscle glycogen stores? Like if they're doing a long event?
Great question. You can actually see, depending on the intensity of exercise. So let's say low intensity exercise, we see studies that athletes can go to 4 to 5 hours before they experience the signal of low, let's say liver glycogen, which would be around 4 to 5 hours. Whereas if you crank the intensity from 40 to 50% of your VO2 max up to 70 to 80% of your VO2 max, you precipitously drop that down to the 1 to 2 hour mark.
Okay.
And so then you get hypoglycemic. That's kind of the signal that you no longer have sufficient glycogen, particularly from the liver, to be able to actually maintain it. But prolonged forms of strenuous exercise, the more strenuous, the quicker you actually break down not only liver glycogen, but also muscle glycogen.
Okay. So if you take a conventional like endurance athlete that's maybe having high carbs before, okay, so they're going to burn through, they're going to rip through whatever the meal that ate, which is probably not as much as they think, right? Because, okay, then let's just say they've got 2 hours of ripping through their glycogen stores.
Okay.
And then they start pumping goo packs, or the patch, right? So they're consistently spiking their insulin, inhibiting lipolysis.
Yep.
But there's no glycogen left. I would imagine that when in the gaps between which they squeeze the goo pack in their mouth, they have insulin elevated, but there's no more glycogen to tap into, but insulin is inhibiting lipolysis. Wouldn't they start to break down muscle tissue?
We don't know.
So you get what I'm going at.
I do see where you're getting at.
Because I've noticed a pattern, and I might get flamed for saying this, but the low carb endurance athletes have more muscle than the high carb endurance athletes. And I've seen that. I can't say 100%, but I look and I see it. And part of me also wonders if maybe the low carb athletes, the low carb endurance athletes are just more conditioned to buffer that, right? Maybe their bodies are more efficient at being in that fasted state. So maybe they're less likely to break down muscle tissue, whereas the high carb athlete potentially has enabled themselves with constant fueling that when they do go without it, they start ripping into their stores.
It's a very good hypothesis that I don't know the answer to. I don't know. I mean, we know that extremely long duration forms of exercise are inherently catabolic. You look no further than blood work of someone who just completed an Ultraman or an Ironman. It's extremely catabolic, and it almost looks like a nuke went off in their biomarkers.
Yeah.
That said, I don't know. Here's the thing, though. Here's this kind of other end of the spectrum, kind of unique paradox here when it comes to carbohydrates or what we're talking about here around nutrition and performance, is that we do see, regardless of the diet, even if you're habituated to a ketogenic diet for 6 weeks or a high carb diet for 6 weeks, we see that if you were to exercise for sufficiently long, you will still see a drop in blood glucose levels if you consume no nutrients during exercise. And we've known this since actually the 1920s, 1925 and 1926, published in the Journal of American Medical Association, published by 2 physicians at Harvard, Gordon and Levin. And what they found is that when they looked at Boston Marathon runners, that Boston Marathon runners would arrive to the end of the marathon with slurred speech. They'd be pale in the face. Some wouldn't even complete it, not because they weren't fit, but because they were presenting these symptoms of altered brain function. They then tested the blood of these athletes and found that the one thing that stood out is that they were getting levels of glucose consistent with hypoglycemia, a phenomenon more common in diabetes type 1 where you over-administer insulin. And so their brain was becoming deprived of energy and essentially shutting down their body. Then next year, they provided carbohydrates in the same athletes, and almost all of them ubiquitously improved performance. This was actually the first trial that I'm aware of that showed that carbohydrates directly improve performance, these 2 studies. But that was on a high carbohydrate paradigm. What happens if someone were to adapt to a ketogenic diet and then rely on fat, which is overwhelmingly abundant on the body, and ketone bodies, which can be produced at high levels on these diets? We still see that the body still oxidizes a degree of circulating glucose levels. Now, it's much less when you're on a ketogenic diet, but you also have much less being put into the system on a ketogenic diet, right? So you're just utilizing much more fat, whereas over here you're using much more carbohydrates. But you still find that if you exercise for long enough, typically at least over 2 hours in duration, in these prolonged strenuous exercise bouts, and some athletes it's over an hour, that you find that these individuals will see drops in glucose levels. And we reviewed over 100 years of evidence, over 160 exercise performance and metabolism trials, over 600 citations, looking at what actually predicts performance across all these different domains, regardless of duration, regardless of all these different nuances that confound the study. Like, what is the most ubiquitous thing that predicts performance? It isn't per se the amount of muscle glycogen they have. It isn't per se the maximal ability to break down and utilize carbohydrates. That's what a lot of people think would be the cause. What we found is that one of the most consistent phenomena when someone consumes carbohydrates during exercise is that they completely eliminate the incidence of hypoglycemia during exercise. Now, what is important to realize is just the drop in glucose levels in the control groups of these studies is what predicted why carbohydrates in the treatment group was improving performance. It wasn't that carb oxidation or glycogen predicted it. It was actually that the placebo group was seeing a drop in glucose levels when we reliably see in longer duration strenuous exercise that carbohydrates lead to performance enhancement. Why does that matter? Because when athletes do a ketogenic diet, they can still benefit from just a trickling in of some carbohydrates during exercise. Some athletes describe that going a ketogenic diet, they're bonk proof, okay, because they have unlimited amounts of fat. But you still use a degree of glucose.
Yeah, you still have to worry about hypoglycemia to a certain degree.
You do, because we've seen it. We've seen that athletes on a ketogenic diet, most recent one in Ironman completers on 6-week ketogenic diet versus high carb, that the incidence of hypoglycemia happened in the majority of athletes going for at least 2 hours or more of exercise on both diets. There was actually a slightly lower glucose level in the low carbohydrate group. But if you actually calculated the total amount of brain energy metabolites in the blood, glucose, ketones, and lactate, all brain fuels, and you do that on the low carbohydrate ketogenic diet, glucose, ketones, and lactate, you calculate them together, they were equivalent, even though there was a higher or lower level of glucose in the very low carbohydrate group, and they both had the same performance. So it seems, again, the theme is that if you can maintain brain energy substrate use during exercise, particularly long duration strenuous exercise, that appears to be one of the strongest predictors of performance. It's not the only one, but it might be the most important one in that particular setting. So that's why I think it's important for athletes to realize that regardless of the diet you're on, there is a place for some degree of carbohydrates in that setting.
Yeah, like 15 grams, 20 grams an hour.
Even less than that, Tom. Like, we've actually found that just 10 grams per hour, so 1 tablespoon of glucose per hour was sufficient to completely abolish the hypoglycemic response. Didn't have major changes in glycogen levels, didn't have major changes in carbohydrate oxidation levels. It specifically mitigated hypoglycemia and improved performance on both diets.
Just to keep your brain functioning, ultimately.
Yes, by 22%.
Jeez.
A huge improvement. And keep in mind, these levels of carbohydrates we administered are 6 to 12 times lower than what current sports nutrition guidelines are recommending. for athletes per hour. So the question is, do we actually need higher levels of carbohydrates during exercise to improve performance, if there even might be a degree of health consequence to doing that all the time? And I think we know right now that the evidence is not supportive of a clear dose response. That's, let's say, at 30 grams versus 60 grams versus 90 grams versus 120 grams. People are pushing the limits to 200 grams nowadays.
So where did this come from? Because I get so frustrated because it's just like, are we going to hold these people accountable when like people start getting diabetes like in their 40s and 50s? Are we going to hold that aren't like, because that's just what's frustrating is like, are we going to continue to like kill these athletes by giving them this amount of, suggesting that this is the right amount of carbohydrate? It frustrates me because it is one of those things like, I think you and I have preached this for quite a while and talked about this. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, this isn't about performance anymore. This is like, if this is needed, this is above and beyond. This is literally like hurting these people.
It has clear potential consequences for these athletes, in some cases, very overt, obvious consequences. I am not here to say you should do this specific diet or this specific nutritional paradigm. Everyone's different. They have to try it for themselves and see how they respond to it and do it the right way. But I'm also here to tell you, you don't have to sacrifice your health to do this. And the amount of pushing of these, like some of the guidelines right now, let's say if you're, doing these, if you're training for like, let's say a very long form of endurance exercise and you're training like upwards of like maybe even 4 hours per day, that if you're an average body weight male, you should be consuming up to almost 1,000 carbohydrates per day. That is, and it's crazy. It's crazy.
That is dangerous. Flat out, that is dangerous.
I think it is clearly has consequences associated to it, right? And the thing is, you're burning it. It's like, okay, but some of these athletes are developing glucose levels consistent with prediabetes.
But playing devil's advocate on the other side is like, people will say that, even with saturated fat, if someone's burning it, like high levels of circulating saturated fat are still going to be problematic.
Yep.
Right? It doesn't matter if you're burning it or not. Like high levels of saturated fat are still going to cause insulin resistance. High levels of saturated fat are still going to cause lipotoxicity and all these other things. How come that argument is okay, but the other one's not? And I'm sorry, I get a little bit heated on that, but it's like, we can't, like, we got to call a spade on both sides here. It's like, that doesn't, selling someone to eat 1,000 grams of carbohydrates because it's going to increase their performance, but because they're protected under the veil of sport, doesn't absolve them the fact that it's killing people. Like, and that's the way that I look at it.
I think it's leading to levels of damage that are often only being detected after multiple years of accumulated suboptimal metabolic health that then progresses over time. And I think that that's incredibly concerning, and why I talk about this is like, look, you don't have to
say it a lot nicer than me, by the way.
Well, Tom, go for it, man. Because what I'm trying to say here is like, you have a choice, right? Like what we reliably show is that the type of diet you're consuming, as long as it's well formulated, it could be high carb or ketogenic diet, you perform equivalently. But the question is beyond performance into health. What are you doing to make sure that you are living a healthy lifestyle? Because again, you don't have to sacrifice your health at the altar of performance. Yeah. You don't have to do that. And I think it's important for people to realize that. And I think what we're starting to realize is that maybe these high volumes of carbohydrates that are being recommended, and you ask why, because there's all these modeling analysis that says that if you're performing at X percentage of your VO2 max for this duration of time, you must need carbohydrates. But yet our studies showed that you can do so with high levels of fat oxidation. We once thought in this sports nutrition community that you can't sustain high levels of prolonged strenuous exercise with fat.
Well, it's been literally said that it's impossible.
But let me give you a perfect case. There was the second best Ironman athlete in the world went into a laboratory setting and was assessed. And they actually in the lab setting completed a world record Ironman time. And if you look at their data, you actually see that about halfway through their time, they flipped to predominant fat oxidation. Okay, so over around half of their entire Ironman time was based predominantly in fat oxidation. So if it is true that you can't do strenuous prolonged exercise bout, how did they literal world record time with one of the best athletes in the world for over half of their endurance exercise bout that led to a world championship time was predominant in fat. That doesn't make sense. How was our study where we saw that over 85% of their VO2 max, when fat oxidation should be near zero if you're on a ketogenic diet and you adapt to it for long enough, that you can actually sustain record levels of fat oxidation? The evidence is no longer consistent that fat oxidation is not able to support these forms of exercise. I think what we're seeing is that it can, and it, in particular contexts, whether a ketogenic diet and adapted to it for long enough, at least 4 weeks or more, or these very high forms, very fit athletes who have extreme metabolic flexibility between carbs and fat, they're able to actually tap into high levels of fat, which is a common predictor of high-level performance. If you can tap into more fat oxidation, it's often associated with higher performance, even on a high-carb diet. So the question is, if an athlete were to hear this and they say, okay, well, like, what am I supposed to do then if I'm trying to maintain my health? The number one thing I would say is, especially if they're starting to see levels of elevated glucose levels, or they even want to try an alternative form of diet that goes maybe against everything they've heard their entire life about what requires for performance. The number one thing is, okay, maybe they're dabbling in this ketogenic diet realm. Maybe they want to get this very low carbohydrate-based diet. The number one thing that I try to tell athletes up front, because they may try and be like, oh, it didn't work for me. And I start asking more questions, even elite level athletes, and I'm like, you did a couple things clearly wrong, but they're preventable and they're predictable. Mm-hmm. Number one is, when athletes do these diets, they need to be very conscious of their caloric intake. Oftentimes when they do these very low carbohydrate-based diets and they're not consuming these highly glycolytic processed carbohydrates, it could be easy to caloric restrict. So it's very important to see what your caloric intake, to track your calories, see what calories maintain your body weight at your current activity, and maintain a level of calories that sustains your current energy needs. Don't go into a caloric restriction, because yes, that probably will impair your performance over the long haul. Number two is to ensure that the diet is well formulated. Okay, that's much more important for an athlete who, when you're talking about micronutrients, macronutrients, phytonutrients within various components of the diet, that is much more important in that setting than it is in other settings. The amount of protein for these athletes is also quite important. Typically, it's recommended to consume upwards of 1 gram per pound of body weight. I think that is much more important for athletes than it is for the gen pop, because they're utilizing their muscles at high rates. And the reason we recommend 1 gram per pound of body weight is because it enhances the recovery response to exercise by providing sufficient amino acids and stimulates something called a muscle protein synthesis response. Another thing that athletes need to prepare for is to ensure that they're buckled in to this journey for at least 4 weeks. Because if they do it for 5 days or 3 weeks, multiple studies will show they might see a marginal impairment in performance, maybe 2%, but they need to allow for the time to sufficiently adapt them to the diet. So they need to prepare themselves for at least a 4-week journey. There's other components to this diet that also are critical for the athlete, particularly hydration and minerals. We know that when you first engage on this diet, and we've talked about this at length, Tom, that you will reduce the amount of insulin, which can be a great metabolic health factor, but it also means less sodium retention, less water retention. And so it's important to also supplement with sodium, or make sure you're having sufficient amount. Athletes usually have to supplement within the first 4-week window, and maybe even a little bit longer, maybe to a less degree, but still doing so to make sure that they're not experiencing any of the issues revolving low sodium in the blood, which initially happens when you first transition to these lower insulin environments, lower glycemic environments.
Creatine's super helpful there too.
Yeah.
In that introductory phase.
Yeah. So creatine is one, it's incredibly helpful across the board, but it's also one of the most reliable sports performance tools there is. It's also, emergent evidence shows it can be helpful for cognition as well. There's a lot of variables in those studies, and a lot of it's emergent. So, but either way, it seems like one of the most harmless supplements there is.
And just from a hydration perspective, I mean, it's just like that intracellular water. I found like when athletes are going into that keto state, when they're first like, what is it that like creatine gets into the cell along with sodium. So it's like with sodium kind of drawing it in, it's kind of increasing that intracellular water volume. So for an athlete that's trying to hyperhydrate and mineralize before in that first transitional period, like increase your creatine dose.
And I also think that where you place that's strategically important, particularly maybe post-exercise, because with your meal post-exercise, you are going to have some insulin. If it has any amount of protein, it's going to have some insulin. And so having the creatine alongside with a meal that has sodium in it, and also some insulin response is going to be required for most of your meals, no matter what, even though probably less than a high carb meal, that's going to help facilitate creatine uptake. But there's other supplements as well, like omega-3s. A lot of athletes may benefit from vitamin D. There's also an abundance of evidence. One of the most reliable sports performance tools out there is during exercises, caffeine and/or the combination with taurine. And so those are things that people can consider supplementing with in their diet. But if they have a well-formulated diet, that's where you start making up for things like potassium or magnesium if you're having sufficient fibrous forms of carbohydrates. So that's why it's so important to have the well-formulated component to this diet. And the last layer to this I think athletes need to consider, and we already touched on this, is that if you are engaging in a prolonged strenuous form of exercise, that is your sport. Let's say you're a marathoner, Ironman completer, ultra marathon runner, or something along those lines. There may be a place for you to strategically place just a certain amount of carbohydrates, what I call the minimal effective dose, enough to maximize your benefits, but not so much where you start consuming enough carbohydrates to spike insulin responses, shut down fat oxidation, or tremendously lower it. Getting sufficient amounts that gives you the maximal return on investment without inducing any of these other major changes that one could contend would take away from your performance, like paradoxically breaking down muscle glycogen early on in exercise when you actually want to keep that potentially for the sprint at the end.
That's awesome. I mean, the only thing I want to wrap up with that I think is very interesting is coming back briefly to the fact that fat oxidation was continuing to occur at higher intensities. First of all, that's fascinating. We've beat that horse a lot. Okay. But this is after weeks on a ketogenic diet. We don't have the cohorts to look at what happens after years of on a ketogenic diet, right? I mean, we have some small data, but not, and I'm not saying that from a negative way. I'm imagining that people probably just get more and more and more enzymatically efficient at utilizing fats because, I mean, that's what the data shows. It's almost dose dependent from a time perspective. It's like the longer they're on, the better they are at doing it. The body is highly adaptable. And, you and I both, I mean, I've said it for a long time, like 10 years, I was, there was a period where I was like about 4 years ketogenic diet without really touching any carbohydrates other than like, and during that period, and we both know Dom D'Agostino too, he's like a freak with this too. I was really bigger, faster, stronger at that state than I ever have been in my life. And then we look at people like Dom D'Agostino that can, dude can rep 505 for 12 plus on deadlift and he's strict ketogenic. And it's just like,
he did that fasted, by the way, not even on a ketogenic diet.
It's just like, so he's so efficient and metabolically clicked into that the adaptation just continues and continues. But I think the big piece that I want to come back to is I know that people watching and listening to this are curious. If you are able to increase your maximum intensity under, at a fat oxidation, I mean, that essentially means that you could literally go do a higher intensity workout and burn more fat, like from a body composition perspective. I mean, it literally would mean that. So whereas we've previously thought that in order to burn fat, we have to stay in this lower intensity zone. So by modifying the diet, we can now shift the entire fat burning zone up to a higher intensity, meaning like even when you go and resistance train or you do something like that, you are now also burning more fat than your counterpart that's resistance training that is not on a lower carb ketogenic diet.
So to that point, it's interesting. I never actually thought of it that way, Tom. You're the first person to bring that up to me in that respect. But everything you're saying does make sense. That you are 100% burning more fat. I mean, we've seen some athletes go up and their fat oxidation capacity from high carb to ketogenic over a 4 to 6 week window, upwards of 300 to 400% higher. Their reliance on carbohydrates can drop substantially along with that. So, and keep in mind, it's not like they're burning zero amounts of carbs after that. They're actually using a more equivalent of both forms of fuel substrate. But yeah, it's an interesting point. I never thought about that. It would be very interesting to look at that over time to see that effect. But one thing I also want to touch on when I'm thinking about this from a body composition perspective is that often when people go on a ketogenic diet, they lose water weight. They lose, because of the sodium drop, because you're not holding as much of that water weight when you have lower insulin levels with these lower carbohydrate diets. But when you have lower water retention, one interesting aspect that I think about a lot is that people are like, well, what about your peak power output? What if you're able to maintain power output at a lower body weight just because you lowered water weight? That could be a tremendously valuable asset for athletes who perform based on power to weight ratio, which is most major sports. Now, if you're talking about powerlifting, if it's at the ultra heavyweight level, irrelevant, big as possible. But if you're weight class dependent, or your sport, hockey, basketball, football, all these things are contingent on how much power you can put out proportional to your body weight in some respect. Okay. And as a result, that could be a situation where some individuals can benefit from attempting to maintain their power output and just having lower overall weight. In fact, there's some studies that show that even, although a little less robust, just a little sprinkle of studies here or there, have shown that even some athletes who get into a not real dehydrated state by any means, but even a marginal, where they see some marginal levels of lower body weight while they're doing endurance exercise, can actually perform better because they're holding less weight. And
plasma volume equation there too. I know that like sometimes if you reduce your plasma volume, that you can actually, there's some interesting stuff there, but it's kind of fringe. But yeah.
So I actually know a lot less about that. I'd be curious to pick your brain on that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's just there's I think for anyone who's interested in this, even those who are at the top end, I think it's important to consider. Most people get into this, they'll think, oh, I'm never going to try that, because they don't want to risk any consequences related to, let's say, their performance, or if they're getting paid to do this, they're even more potentially apprehensive. But a lot of that apprehension, I hope, will be removed, because you'll never know what you may gain from doing this unless you try. Okay. And I think that is something that is lost on many people. It's like, well, why do you even need to do it? I'm like, well, there's a lot of reasons why someone may consider doing this. And it may not be today why they need to do it. Maybe tomorrow or later on in life, when we start getting a higher and higher level of focus around health, because in youth, you're like, well, I'm fine. I don't need to worry about this. I got forever to live, because you're just looking at everyone around you and thinking, I got time. Whereas the reality is that we are aging proportional to what we do, not only today or even in youth, but it's the accumulation of those choices over years and years and years that ultimately make an impact. Just like the analogy of the first cigarette you smoke doesn't give you lung cancer, but it's the amount of cigarettes you smoked over years and years and years, every single day, over time. That total volume is what's predicting your incidence and risk for overall lung cancer risk. And the same can be applied of the overall health choices you make, not just that one meal or one day, but it's the weeks and months and ultimately years of those choices that accumulate into the life well lived. Not only your health span, but your lifespan. And so I think that it's important for people to find out what fits them best and try different things, maybe even at different points in their life, to fit their goals, not just for performance, Tom, but also to maximize their health.
No, I'm with you, man. Well, Andrew, where can everyone find you, brother?
I try to put out as many free resources as I possibly can at andrewkoutnik.com, ANDREWKOUTNIK.com. I'm also active on Instagram and YouTube at akoutnikphd, and also on X and Twitter at AKOUTNIK, so akoutnik. If anyone wants to reach out there, or just kind of see the most up-to-date literature that we're putting out on these topics, as idea evolves and as science kind of grows, we learn more and we evolve our thinking.
Right on, my man. Thanks, buddy.
Hey, bro. Appreciate it, man.